Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of The Invisible Men. My name is Ian Rowe, Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and also the founder of Vertex Partnership Academies, a virtues-based international baccalaureate public charter high school in the Boogie Down Bronx.
I'm Nique, a member of the Leadership Network at AEI and an adjunct professor at Rice Business School and the WashU Olin Business School.
Nique,
Ian,
as always, great to see you.
great to see you, my friend, and welcome back from your trip to DC.
Yes,
For
yes.
our audience, Ian was on Capitol Hill having conversations with some important politicians about education and children and agency. So if you have an opportunity, find Mr. Rowe's commentary. In fact, we'll try and post it somewhere on the Invisible Men
Yeah,
website.
yeah, and
But
maybe
Ian,
we'll even talk about it here.
that'd be great. Ian, I think we've got to talk about the election. Uh, Seismic shift in so many aspects of American society, especially the black vote. You know, you and
Yeah,
I, of course, just recently read an editorial by one of your good friends, Jason Riley, about what happened from along racial lines in terms of the election, where 25% of all black men voted for President-elect Trump, and over 33% of black men between the ages of 18 and 44 voted for President-elect Trump. Incredible.
right. Incredible. I mean, what's interesting. So first of all, great to see you. And yes, we have to talk about the election because I think half the country is just like, what just happened, and the other half is like, we're so happy what happened. But yeah, we got to talk about the black vote in particular, or the minority vote. I mean, what's interesting is when we say 25% of black men voted for Trump, one person's response would be, "That's terrible. That's so low." Right? Right?
It
But the
is low.
point is, it's such a dramatic increase. And when you're talking about 33% of all black between ages 18 to 44, these are seismic. That was the right word. These are huge shifts. And so the question is, what does it mean? I mean, so something is happening, right? It has always been the Democratic Party could basically just take black people for granted. Like, we've
100%.
got them in the bag. We've got at least 90% of that group. Why even bother campaigning for them? Like in developing countries, when it's election time, when like the local potholes have been filled, because that's that's when the politicians come around and like offer some trinkets, to say, yeah, no, we serve you, but then ignore you until the next election. And that's what it has historically felt like. The Democratic Party, whatever your politics, because I'd be saying the same thing if it was the Republican Party. Anytime you basically can assume 90 to 100% of a particular demographic group is going to vote for you, what motivation do you have to serve them? Like,
Those
none,
resources to get elected need to move to people that you don't have 90% control.
right? You show up once every 4 years. You show up at a community bake-off or something. You say, I'm with you, and then you leave. And then your policies don't particularly have any significantly positive impact because the same conditions seem to be consistent over and over and over again. But clearly, and then, in the United States, and then we had Barack Obama, and then the black community, not only did you have traditionally white leadership advocating for, saying that they were the party of for people of color, then we had the first black president, twice elected with 70 million plus votes. And so it almost seemed like, and back in 2008 and 2012, this was the mantra. Basically, there's a new permanent coalition that is permanently for the Democratic Party, right? Because you've got Barack Obama, he's been elected twice, he's got the Rainbow Coalition, and that has all turned out not to be true. And this election, I think, proved that. So yeah, so we should definitely need to talk about what is happening and
And,
why.
and and for our audience, this Wall Street Journal article, which is titled Trump's election victory and the death of racial tribalism, it's written by a former guest on our podcast, Jason Riley, and the individual who's quoted throughout the piece is Shelby Steele, who also has been a past guest on the show. And I think one of the things I want to get on the table to discuss with you, Ian, is a quote from Mr. Steele, which is as it relates to sort of the black vote. He writes, or he is quoted as saying, "I think it's progress because it's breaking up this idea that race is in itself meaningful, that it has some truth to deliver in political contests." So I
He's
ask
right.
you, Ian, firstly, do you agree with him?
Well, you know what's interesting about our country is that so let me just say I hope that he's right. Right? I hope that he's right that race will become as meaningful as, people have said in a colorblind society, your skin color should mean as much as the shade of your eye, your eye color. And I think we would be a far better society if we thought in that way, because we would recognize each other as individuals with human dignity, with inherent dignity, and that you're treated not based on the color of your skin, but the content of your character. So I hope he's right. It may be that depending on what happens over the course of the next 4 years, if you have an unsuccessful presidency, and in particular certain demographic groups by race aren't successful, then who knows, we might snap back to the same kind of racial tribalism that has seemed to dominate. So nothing is permanent. That's the thing about our country. Nothing is, which is adds to our vibrancy in a sense, but we don't know. But I certainly hope that he is right. I mean, in that same article, Jason Riley writes, in 2024, Kamala Harris couldn't rely on blind racial loyalty from minority voters, nor guilt from white voters to the extent that Barack Obama had in 2008, right? So even there you see this shift over time, that back in 2008, Obama's numbers were like, I think 95%. Literally, dramatic, right? And so at that time, there was a feeling, oh, we're done. This is a permanent Democratic majority who will consistently get 95+% of the vote. And yet, 16 years later, it's different. So I think Shelby Steele is right in the moment, and I want him to be right, but nothing is permanent. And I hope for most Black Americans, what hopefully should become clear, no one should take your vote for granted simply because of race nor gender, because clearly it has not demonstrated itself to be a useful tool in gaining accountability from who the presidential leadership is.
Agreed. My take on some of the quotes from that from the excellent piece in the WSJ is that race is still very much present, but it is being applied in different ways. And what I mean by that is, if we go back to President Obama, I would make an argument that if he was married to a white woman, I don't think he would have been elected president of the United States. That I think actually the race of his wife was a benefit racially for a number of groups to feel comfortable about him. I think Black women were much more comfortable with him, loving and cherishing a Black woman. I think Black men felt good about that. And I think even a large segment of white society felt good about what that represented.
So interesting, because the irony, of course, is that because of the one drop rule, Barack Obama is Black, but he had a Black, father and a white mother. And so what's interesting about what you're saying is that it may have been that the race of Michelle Obama made him more authentically black because he was a mixed race. And I mean, you might be right. I mean, Barack Obama, he was a transcendent figure back in 2008. I mean, he came out of nowhere. He was telegenic. He beat Hillary Clinton. He seemed perfect for the time. And of course, his 2004 convention speech about One America was inspiring. So it's hard to say, but the America of today is very different. I think that this election, I do think, showed that assumptions about race, or assumptions about what I think because of a certain race, can no longer be taken for granted. And I hope that endures. Because look, if you're a voter, you want every party to be authentically competing for your vote. Yeah.
But so let me continue my somewhat inflexible perspective and apply that same filter to Vice President Harris, who also had some challenges about her authenticity. I mean, when Janet Jackson comes out and says, "I don't think she's a black woman," you got some issues.
Right.
And so, by chance, her mate happens to not be a black person or a Latino person, a white man. And I'd argue, I don't think she would have won the election, but I'd argue if she had a black husband, she would have done better than she did, because I think she would have done better with black men. And I think that collective base would have rallied a bit more behind her. I don't have any data to prove this, but certainly there were questions about her authenticity. I mean, I think Candace Owens, ran for about 6 weeks content about Vice President Harris she's not black. She comes from a slaveholding family in Jamaica. And she went so as far, Ian, I don't know if you saw this, but there's a picture, I guess, in a memoir that the vice president published. And she has her arm around a black woman that's several shades darker than her, and she refers to her as her grandmother. Well, Candace Owens spent about 4 weeks proving, I think, to a 90 percentile accuracy that woman is not her grandmother. That in fact it was someone else, and she was. Now then the question becomes, Candace, she was using her to attract blackness, to increase her blackness. I can't speak to that, but so anyway, my filter, my kind of pessimistic perspective, I think it had some impact on the vice president's campaign.
I mean, it's quite possible. I mean, it is hard to sift through, because even in that example, it's one issue whether or not this woman is was a true grandmother. That's an issue of race, but it's also an issue of trust. Like, was this person lying? And that could have also eroded confidence in her. And on Kamala Harris's husband, what would have happened if he were black? Because it is interesting, because black women voted heavily for Kamala Harris, right? And there's an article in the New York Times that we should also talk about.
Yeah,
just came out today about a black woman, urging the Democratic Party to not treat black women as an afterthought. So we'll talk about that in a second. It's so interesting. If Kamala Harris, it does seem like it hurt her. It does seem like it hurt her, whether or not the race of her husband, because I think it's so hard to sift through. But throughout the entire campaign, which for her was 107 days,
right,
it was never quite clear who she was or what she stood for, right? So on every dimension, what did you do as vice president? Have you stood on your own? Have you earned your own keep? And so even that, on the race issue, the fact she wasn't married, I hate racial stereotypes that say you are somehow less or more or less authentic based on the race of your spouse, right? I hate those kinds judgments because it really should be irrelevant, but who knows? I mean, how people interpreted. I mean, and by the way, her husband during the
Oh
campaign,
boy.
there were some pretty negative things about his past, and that were some were falsehoods. Well, some were rumor, but some were true. Like he slept with the nanny. All these, and so there
Messy.
were things
Very
also
messy.
that his behavior um, hurt her, and you can't avoid that. But we should talk about this article by this woman in the New York
Please.
Times. Yeah, so her thing is classic classic kind of victimized language. So her basic thing is, Democrats must stop treating black women as an afterthought. And meanwhile, again, like these are like Obama type numbers in 2016, but overwhelming majority of black female votes, especially in swing states, Georgia, Nevada, Michigan, even though Kamala Harris lost those amongst black women, there was a huge turnout for her. And this writer, and you got to listen to this language. She says the reason that the Democrats, or the reason that black women have to really believe in Democrats and get Democrats to continue to prioritize. She says in 2023 alone, black women lost nearly $43 billion in potential earnings compared with white men. And so for her, that's the evidence that somehow the Democratic Party is going to solve that problem, right? Whatever you feel about that particular statement. But then she goes on to say, so they lost $43 billion. And then because they are often segregated into lower paying jobs. So just think about that statement for a second. Black women are often segregated into lower paying jobs. So this isn't, I'm just going to raise an issue here, which is not even about political party. It's what your worldview is. When
Yes.
you say things like black women were often segregated into lower paying jobs, that's language that suggests the world is happening to you. Black women were segregated. Someone in control was putting these black women into lower paying jobs. It's a kind of language that suggests you have no agency. It's like mass incarceration. Well, yeah, it's the mass incarceration. They're just being put into prison as if there's no behavior that is at the core of whatever that negative outcome may be. This isn't to suggest that there aren't structural barriers. I run schools in the Bronx, so I know that we
Yes,
don't
sir.
have enough, particularly low income kids having access to high quality education. All of those things still need to be addressed. But when you have this kind of mindset of you're being segregated into lower paying jobs, even before we get to this sort of blind loyalty to one particular party, that's a worldview that is, in my view, inherently harmful.
It's incredibly twisted. It's first of all, it's wrong, and to throw out $43 billion in that way. I frankly, when you sent this piece to me, I couldn't believe it was in the New York Times. That the New York Times would allow that sort of sloppy logic to exist in their paper. I guess I shouldn't be surprised. But just to the title of the piece, Ian, this idea of being an afterthought. Now, I'm assuming people that have that view, what they care about are symbols of power. So, well, President Biden gave you a Supreme Court justice. He specifically said, I'm going to find a black woman to sit in that seat.
Right? He
And,
did.
and then that same president stepped out of his seat so a black woman could potentially become the first black woman president of the United States. So I don't even know the premise
Right.
of black women being an afterthought. I'm not even sure. I don't. What are they expecting? I mean, because that's the game they play. They play the numbers game. They play the seats at the table game, and so that's what the Democrats are giving you: seats at the
on on
table, numbers.
on the night of the election on MSNBC, Joy Reid, the commentator, was going on and on about how perfect a campaign that Kamala Harris had run, and she was giving all these examples of how amazing it was flawless. I mean, she used these words. It was flawless, and then she says, and Queen Latifah endorsed her. Queen Latifah endorsed Harris. Queen Latifah doesn't endorse anybody. I'm like, what is going on here? It's so insulting. And and the thing is, I think we as a country are better when we've got two strong parties that have ideological differences towards the same mission of improvement of conditions for all American people. But when you have this kind of blind loyalty of saying, no, 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 we just got to put ourselves in this box for this party. It has not yet demonstrated the level of self-reflection that is needed after a political beating that just occurred.
You just raised a point that I want to talk about, Ian. The use of celebrities, especially by the Democratic Party. I think back to 2016, I believe it was, where Cardi B interviewed Joe Biden. And,
Oh yeah.
at one level, I celebrate Carly B's hustle and her ability to build her brand and overcome, I think, some disadvantage in her earlier life as an adult dancer. But her music is filth. Her message is twisted, nonsensical pop culture garbage.
Yeah.
And she is by no measure an intellectual representative of either the hip hop culture or Black America. Yet the Democratic Party thought it was a great idea to have her interview a presidential candidate. It's insulting.
So what's interesting about that, right? So what's interesting about that is that at least it was an interview, right? So fast forward to Kamala Harris's campaign, when I think in Atlanta, she's doing an event, and suddenly Megan Thee Stallion comes out and she's twerking on stage. And it was specifically to attract Black people. How low of an opinion do you have to have for a group of people where you think the thing to attract them to vote for your candidate is to have this woman come out and dance salaciously on stage? No, just think about that. It's the same thing, right? It's horrible. It's horrible. And again, there isn't this level of self-reflection to say, maybe that's what's contributing to this shift in racial attitude or attitudes of people of different race. Yes. Maybe we want to be treated and respected as individuals who actually have concerns about things like inflation or foreign policy or the ability to send my kid to the school of my choosing. That's where we need to get to. And to the degree that the Democrats don't recognize this, then there is a permanent majority. But now it's in a different direction than what occurred in 2008 and 2012.
100%. As I've gotten older, I don't follow sports much, but the only thing I do follow is mixed martial arts and combat sports. And there was a very common theme through kind of the last month and a half run up to the election that Joe Rogan stated it several times, that people that participate in combat sports, jiu-jitsu, judo, wrestling, are part of the MMA community, they inherently lean right. And again, no statistical data, but it was fascinating. Towards the end of the campaign, there were probably a dozen UFC fighters that stood up and said, we're with Trump, of all races. And frankly, I think of both genders. And so Joe Rogan has articulated this idea of, once you start to focus on personal health and strength and self-defense, that there's an inherent shift that occurs. Maybe it's more of a masculine thing, but a shift to the right and a shift towards agency. Your book, towards agency and responsibility.
Self-determination. And whether you like the Democrats or the Republicans, whatever your political ideology, I would think you agree that one party seems to more focus on independence, self-determination, the concept of agency, and another is more government intervention, dependency, and that kind of ethos of I have to wait. I have to have blind loyalty to a singular party for my life to be better. And so I'm not surprised that that is happening because and to me it's actually stunning. It really is stunning that there could be such political blindness to this what happened during this election, and most importantly, what has happened since the election, because there doesn't seem to be an appreciation on the part of the leadership of the Democratic Party to identify any of these trends.
100%. So, Ian, before we wrap up, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about your recent trip to Washington and speaking in front of Congress. Why don't you tell the audience what that was about, and let's have a little bit of discussion.
Yeah, I had the honor of being invited to testify the U.S. House of Representatives to the Education and Workforce Committee. And this was the subcommittee on elementary, middle, and secondary education. And the topic was curriculum in K to 12 education. The America's founding principles, how do you teach about civic virtue, and what are the right ways to do it? And it's interesting because the federal government typically does not play a role in crafting curriculum because that's much more of a school or state-driven initiative. So it was an interesting choice even to have the hearing. But I thought it was quite powerful because what it highlighted was that a role that the federal government can play is highlighting exemplars of curricula that does represent a more comprehensive teaching of American history, for example, or that highlights civic virtues. So I was very proud to represent the school I lead, Vertex Partnership Academies, because our school is organized around the 4 cardinal virtues of courage, justice, temperance, and wisdom, and how we, imbue those tools, those virtues throughout our curriculum to help our kids build a sense of agency. So, for example, courage, we have these what we call I statements. So courage is I reject victimhood and boldly persevere, even in times of uncertainty and struggle. And so think about, a group of kids in the Bronx, 14, 15, standing in their blazers and their ties, their Vertex ties. I reject victimhood. It's really powerful when our students are saying that in unison, right? This collective experience. Or temperance is I lead my life with self-discipline because I am responsible for my learning and behavior. So I talked about that, and I talked about my work with the Woodson Center, where we've developed a curriculum focused on the African American experience in the United States. And this curriculum has now been downloaded more than 200,000 times by teachers in all 50 states. I mean, great stuff. But it was an interesting discussion because we got around critical race theory, and a couple of the elected officials saying there's no such thing as critical race theory in K to 12 schools. And I said, well, actually, it's true. You won't hear in first grade, a teacher talking about repudiation of equality theory, right? But you will see practices that have been adopted, such as privilege walks. Are you familiar with what a privilege walk is? Have you ever seen one of these?
I believe it's where they separate the students by race and give the opportunity for a minority group to have a private conversation or a private walk. Is that the...
Well, in this case, privilege walks are, imagine you're a teacher in the classroom. You have all your students line up in a horizontal line. Sometimes you do this outside so you get more space. But the teacher then offers a series of instructions, which are all reductionist, horrific reductionist. So, for example, the first instruction would be, if you're black, take, you know, 3 steps backward, but if you're white, take 2 steps forward, right? And there are a series of these instructions. So by the end of the exercise, by the end of the privilege walk, who's at the back, who are the kids, and you turn around, oh boy, your life must suck, you're, whoa, man, if you're at the front of the line, you're like, I guess I'm the oppressor, you know, it's all horrible. It's all horrible. So that is
That's
the
sick.
practice that is happening, and I just sent someone an article in the New York Post about this happening in Evanston, Illinois, where a teacher actually sued the school district, saying this violates civil rights, not only the teachers that are forced to do it, but the students, you know. And so I think, there's this question of, is critical race theory being taught in our schools? And I think there is this important distinction. Critical race theory is, of course, a legal theory which is taught certainly in law school. And so, again, you won't hear the words about, what Delgado describes as critical race theory, and this idea that racism is imbued in every institution in America. You won't hear that in second grade. But it's the underlying ideology where we're seeing lots of practices. So, for example, when states now across the country are seeing that there are racial disparities in the graduation rates of black students versus white students, like even here in New York, we're about to get rid of the regents. States are saying, well, if there are racial disparities, then that must be due to racial discrimination. So what are we going to do? We're not going to think about how do we improve K to 12 or improve like more school choice to get access to high quality schools. Let's just get rid of the assessment, right? Let's just get rid of the objective tool that's exposing the disparity, right? That is also a function of an underlying ideology which critical race theory is driving, which is assuming every institution must be just scarred with systemic racism. And so that's what that's what the ideologies then say must be the practice to solve it. So we talked about that at this hearing. I thought it was very productive. It got a little heated, because, sometimes if your narrative is challenged, you don't want to accept it. But that's what's happening on the ground in schools.
One last question as we wrap this up, and it's fun just you and I chatting, Ian. So, a question I asked you at the Parkland conference a few years ago was, given your place in society and the role that you've taken on as an educator and a leader and a thought leader, where is it that you are best situated to drive the kind of impact that we have to have? And I think I offered to you at that time, I said, Secretary of Education, Chancellor of the Chicago Public School System, Chairman and founder of Vertex Partnership Academy, or some other role, Mayor of Chicago. Where do you see yourself?
Wow.
Where is the greatest leverage?
Oh my gosh! First of all, it's that's a very humbling question to be asked, because I could be asking the same thing of you, my friend. Well, you know what? I guess ground floor, the only one that would allow me to continue to be a good father and good family person. No, seriously.
Yes.
No, because actually, we have to start at home first before any of these lofty positions become available, because frankly, if everyone had that particular position, the chancellor of schools wouldn't actually be as important, right? Because if every parent, if every parent were taking care of their kids and keeping all the demons out and making sure their kid is getting a great access to great education, then these lofty positions wouldn't be as important. So I would say the most important is to ensure that I can continue to be a great dad for my own kids. Seriously. And 100%. Then, yeah. And then, I don't know, man. I love running schools, because, I was in Washington. I was in the Rayburn building, this lovely congressional chamber, and then next day I actually had to go to Chicago for another presentation, and then today I was back in the Bronx, talking with students, and there's nothing like being reminded of why we do this work in the first place, like talking to actual students who,
Brilliant.
frankly, are relying on us
Yes.
to be exceptional every day, right? That's our charge. That's why their parents entered the lottery for our schools. And so there's something very tactile about having direct interaction with kids that would be hard to give up.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Well, Ian, thanks for the time. Fun to just chat
Yeah,
with you.
great, man.
I think we need to do this more often when there are especially hot topics.
Well, these days it seems like there's a hot topic. Maybe we'll talk about bathrooms next time.
Oh boy. or women's volleyball teams. Yeah, I'll tell you what, I would love to talk about that.
Might get ourselves in trouble, but what I told a crowd of people yesterday in Chicago, and we were talking about family structure and race. Like, we got to talk. You can't have a discussion about improving outcomes for kids if you're not brave enough to talk about what has happened to the American family. Black families, white families. And so if these things become taboo, then you're not actually serious. You aren't. You're not, because you're not being honest. You're not being honest.
100%. 100%.
Yep.
All right. Well, until next time, thank you, my brother.
Thanks, Nique. All right, to our listeners, it was a great episode of The Invisible Men. If you want to capture our other episodes, please go to www.invisible.men. And with that, take it easy.